Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war frontline update actually for yesterday, the 25th of March. I recorded the video and had it recording the wrong screen, so you couldn't see the map at all. What a waste of my time and some of your time as well. I do apologise. Occasionally, once in a blue moon, or maybe, I don't know, 17 times a week, I am an unadulterated muppet. And last night was one of those occasions. So here is a map, and let's try and be somewhat quick with it because I have lots to do. This is a good map for Ukraine, as in there are more blue pins than there are pink and red pins. And that is a sign from both mappers that I synthesize here, Andrew Perpetua and Syriac Maps. That's a sign that Ukraine are definitely countering. They are taking more territory than the Russians, just empirically from the number of pins. And that has not happened very often in the last, I don't know, year or so. So it's really good news for the Ukrainians, although these are small scale territorial gains. We're talking about Belgorod. We're talking about a little bit on the northeastern front. We're talking about around Turetsk and New York, and then Prokrosk. So those are the four main areas. But alongside that, not huge numbers of Russian gains. Now, this is only a sort of 1.5, 2 day update. So take that into account as well. When we look at what is going on up in the north, we can see that the Russians are continuing to squeeze the Ukrainians in the Kursk area, particularly the northern of the two sectors that the Ukrainians still have some control over inside the Russian territory, and possibly the Russians moving south into Sumy Oblast in a number of places. That's more what is claimed by Syriac Maps as opposed to Andrew Perpetua. Nonetheless, there are these gains either just inside the Russian border or just outside into the Ukrainian border in a few places. But also interesting that in the Kursk Oblast, and I don't know if this is a counterattack or a rejigging, but Ukrainians having more control, or the Russians not having control over Guaivo. In the Kursk Oblast, that southern sector, I don't know if that is the Ukrainians counterattacking there. Then, although it's pretty complex in the Belgorod region, as in complex as in the map, Syriac Maps has loads of polygons that make this all confusing, and then overlays polygons on polygons, and we just take Syriac Maps map and put it on ours together with Andrew Perpetua's map. So it's a lot of confusing colours. So really just concentrate on the pins here. And the pins, the light blue pins represent where the Russian defensive line was, as according to Andrew Perpetua, and the blue line represents where the Russian defensive line is now. In other words, you have an advance for the, well, not necessarily this denoting the exact advance of the Ukrainians, because there will be grey zone and then the Ukrainian defensive line after that. So this is where the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back, and that's quite significant. A little bit of a disagreement between the mappers, with Syriac Maps claiming the Ukrainians being pushed back in the Belgorod region around Demidovka, but it seems to be fairly well accepted now that Demidovka has seen the Russians being pushed out of the village and the Ukrainians gaining control over Popovka, with fighting towards Grefovka, I presume, still ongoing. Let's see what some of the claims are. Pro-Ukrainian channel, and this was a few days ago now, reports the Ukrainians have cleared the village of Demidovka or Demidivka there. So that's a fairly standard claim that we've seen over the last few days. And then there were claims that Popovka, this other village just actually to the west, really, west-northwest of Demidovka, it has been taken. That's actually closer to the border. So the border's here. Popovka's actually closer, but because there's a water feature in a way, and I think further south of it as well, it's probably a little bit difficult to get to access from the Ukrainian border side. So they might have had to have taken Demidovka first and then accessed it from maybe the southeast as opposed to from the Ukrainian border. But anyway, Ukrainian infantry groups are attempting to flank Demidovka, moving closer to Popovka. Fighting has broken out with the border guard positions. Now, this claim isn't that they have control of Popovka, but there are a number of other claims that they do have control of Popovka, the Ukrainians. According to Russian sources from NOR reports here, Ukrainian units are now trying to widen the area of control near Demidovka and are actively moving towards Popovka. And that's a couple of days ago now as well. So, yeah, various claims that the Ukrainians do control Popovka, but as you can imagine, it's probably quite dynamic there. So the Ukrainians still pushing in Belgorod. Not a huge amount of info coming out of there due to operational security. And then when we come along to Kharkiv, no change to the Kharkiv sectors that the Russians have into Ukraine. Although there are no changes to the mapping up here in the Kupyansk area, there are claims that the Ukrainians are having at least some joy around there. What do we have here? This is Kotliarivka, the Kharkiv Oblast, Kupyansk direction. Ukrainian forces have captured several Russian strongholds near Kotliarivka. That's actually up here near Kislivka, Kotliarivka. So this area where the road is coming down here, the Surat Maps, very different to Andrew Perpetua there. That's a claim that the Ukrainians have taken control of that area there. So that's good news. Not on our mappers yet. Just going to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank. Did they have anything about Kharkiv and Kupyansk area? No, it's more the Liman direction as we come further to south. So as we come down here, we can see that there are some gains for the Ukrainians around Nadir, which we'd heard previously. Andrew Perpetua showing the Russians have been pushed back around there, and I think it's the 3rd Assault Brigade have had a successful time around there, taking back some territory. So more blue pins, excellent stuff. As we come down to the Liman direction, though there are no changes to the mappers here, sort of Terny, Torska, Serebyansky Forest, Makivka up there. The Institute for the Study of War does say a Ukrainian brigade operating in the Liman direction reported that Russian forces have a 10-1 manpower advantage in some areas, consisting mostly of well-trained contract soldiers. That's a huge personnel advantage for the Russians in that area. That's something to think about. A little bit of a worry there for the Ukrainians. Also worth noting up here, a Russian mill blogger complained about the poor quality and insufficient quantity of FPV drones being supplied to the Russian drone crews, suggesting federal funds are being wasted. Yep. So that is good news for the Ukrainians there. But then we come down to the Syriac Frontline. Institute for the Study of War claims that the Russians might have made some gains south of Volkanovka-Milyansk. A huge difference between the two mappers in this general region. And it's not the only place on the front line where we see that. In fact, there really is some significant difference between our two synthesized mappers. No change to Chasiv Yar direction. That's good news for the Ukrainians. I have just seen, actually, since I've done my update, let's see if it's synced. I have a feeling there is a change to the Chasiv Yar area. Let's just see if it was this map. The Grayskull one. Yes, so Velikonov-Silka has been liberated according to a pro-Russian channel. So that is just, I'm sure that's north of, up here, north of Chasiv Yar, sort of north of the Solidar area, Velikonov-Silka there. So the Ukrainians pushing the Russians out of that, around Saku Vanseti, to the north of this. If you remember, there was a road came down to Paraskevivka through Bahadatny, and this was the front line for some time where you had Solidar had been taken. Goodness me, that seems like an age ago. And then they were fighting over this area and all up here. Well, actually, it's moved not too far, really, to the west, but it's good to see that Ukrainians have had some success there. Apparently, that might be updated on the next mapping update that's probably already taken place. So no change to Chasiv Yar. Good news for the Ukrainians, I would wager. Then when we come down to Turetsk and New York, some good news for the Ukrainians here. So let's look at some of the mapping updates. The Ukrainian armed forces advance into the city centre. So if you look at this, there's no block upwards here of Russian control. So looking at my map here, both Andrew Perpetua and Syriac Maps have this as not under Ukrainian control. This is Russian controlled area. Well, this map suggests that actually that what has been taken, not updated on our map, even though this is sort of 3 days ago at the time I did the mapping. So I would expect that to have changed, but it might change in the next mapping update. This area, Ukrainians are apparently in control. We can see from the blue pins here that this section is what Syriac Maps has seen as, they see it now as under Ukrainian control, or at least with the Russians pushed back there. So there is some change to that section of the Turetsk city environment. We also have a further claim here. Ukrainians reportedly restarting counterattacks in Turetsk, in the center of Turetsk. So not only are they fighting here, but there's also fighting to the south, and that's around the New York area. And that's a huge area of land that is claimed to have been retaken. The Azov Brigade completing the clearing of Shebunivka and Leonidivka as the brigade continues to advance towards Nelipivka. Okay, so as we come out of this area, we come down to here, and that is the claim that the Ukrainians have actually pushed the Russians right back really to where Andrew Perpetua already has the Russian defensive line. So there's a big difference here between the two mappers, and that grayscale map is not in accordance with Surat Maps' interpretation of what's going on there. What else do we have? No, that's going on to Prokrosk area. So that's really good news for the Ukrainians, that they are pushing the Russians back and making some fairly significant gains there. I mean, that's a large area of land, especially since it's urban area, and urban fighting street to street can be really grinding, really attritional, and take an awful long time. Goodness me, you remember the days of Bakhmut, and yet the Ukrainians appear to have pushed the Russians back fairly quickly there. If that is true, that might give you an indication of how weakly the Russians might be controlling some of these areas, that they don't have the massive personnel they probably need. That could be because they have drafted a lot of the soldiers potentially up to the Kursk area. So if they do have 70,000 people up in Kursk, those 70,000 people have come from somewhere, right? Then when we come further to the south, although this is not something that Andrew Perpetua has agreed with, Surat Maps claiming that around Alexandropil, and Pentelum and Ivka, the Russians have made some gains. But yeah, as I say, Andrew Perpetua not confirming that. No change around the junction here on the T0504 highway. Good news there. And then, although Surat Maps claiming that the Russians might have made some small gains in Pischany, most others claim that the Ukrainians are pushing both here and the other side towards Solone, although Syriac Maps agrees that the Ukrainians have made the gains in towards Solone and just north of Uspinivka. Also, I think most people would agree that the area north of the railway is not under Russian control, although mappers do disagree. Both of them have a little area of control north of the railway line there. Okay, so here we have it. The Ukrainians broke through at Solonia in the Prokrosk direction, this sort of thin sliver towards that village of Solonia, fighting on the outskirts of there, north of Uspinivka. And again, mentioned here from a Russian source, Prokrosk direction. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian armed forces have advanced in Uspinivka, having completely taken a third street in the village of Solonia. That is here, taking some streets there. I mean, there really is only one street, to be fair. But yeah, so they are fighting through that town or that village at the moment. Good news again for the Ukrainians. Right, then we move on to, I'm going to whiz through here, but this is all good news. And by the way, just to say something about Turetsk, so back up here around New York and Turetsk, in the Institute for the Study of War, there is a claim that the deputy commander of the Ukrainian battalion in the Turetsk direction reported that the Russian division commander was dismissed due to lack of progress, with higher command now directly controlling forces in the area. So that probably that gives you an indication that the Russians are struggling there somewhat, that someone's been sacked for a lack of progress for the Russians there. Now, we're going to come down, although neither of the mappers signified any change here, apparently there is some fairly significant activity that the Ukrainians have been involved in around Kostiantynopil there. So we are going to go to some of our sources. Here one says, Ukrainian forces have fully expelled the enemy from Kostiantynopil in the Kharkiv direction. The majority of the settlement is now under firm control of the defense forces, so the Russians were smoked out street by street, and now it's our ground, they say. That is to claim that this road coming down here is at the very least grey zone, certainly not under control of the Russians, and that the Ukrainians have taken control of this part of Kostiantynopil, moving the Russians further to the east. So if we go back to that, when you have that road coming down, and then south of there, like all of the town is now under Ukrainian control to the south of this road, all of it here, with a tiny bit of grey zone just down here. So that is to say that the Ukrainian defensive line now comes down here, and the Russian defensive line is much further back here. Probably Andrew Perpetua is more correct in this area, and that's why he's not signified any change, because the change will be to the grey zone, no doubt. And that doesn't get picked up by my synthesis of mapping the Russian defensive lines. But suffice to say that if those mappers are correct, Andrew Perpetua and these other mappers, then Surat Maps is very much wrong. And the Ukrainians have had some success there. So as another source says, successful tactical counteroffensive in the area where the Ukrainians have pushed Russian forces back in the Kharkiv direction. They have completely cleansed the settlement of Kostiantynopil of occupiers and are fortifying their positions on the ground. It is expected that the tactical offensive operation will continue as well. So the idea is they're not stopping there, which is interesting because Andriivka and Ulakli here, these were quite important, particularly Andriivka. It's quite a hub, and it was the Russians took this land relatively easily. I don't know if that's right, but relatively quickly, all things considered. But again, it might be that they just don't have the forces to really robustly control these areas, and it makes it somewhat easy for the Ukrainians to take the land back. It's sort of a Pyrrhic victory there, or the culmination that has left them somewhat weaker. Yes, so this is Kostiantynopil. Again, another map interpretation there from someone else, fairly similar, and saying that, the Ukrainians have robust control over most of the settlement with then either grey zone, probably grey zone for the edge of that settlement there, according to that mapper. And that's pretty much it. I mean, as we come down towards the, you can ignore that. I don't think that's correct. But there's a tiny bit of a gain in the Velikonov-Silka direction for the Russians, but really no change for the rest of the front line, no change along the whole of the Zaporizhia front, and indeed, as you'd expect, no change along the Dnipro River either. So, all things considered, a good day there for the Ukrainians. I probably could do another map date already, now that this is probably a good half day out of date. But take it where we can get it. I guess as a pro-Ukrainian, that there are more Ukrainian pins than Russian pins is a good sign. And it does indicate, I think, that the Russians have culminated. The question is going to be what happens with the huge forces amassed up here, the Russian forces. Are they going to continue pushing into Sumy to really flush out the Ukrainians? Are they going to get moved to Belgorod to flush the Ukrainians out of there? Are they going to be pulled down to the front line where the Ukrainians appear to be gaining some momentum at the moment? But I'll keep you up to date. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.